bought a company called Secure Islands back in 2015 or so. And then slowly that's turned into Microsoft Information Protection and now Microsoft Purview Information Protection. So
MPIP,
yeah. So the functionality is mostly the same. As far as the MIP labeling is concerned, like the pattern of having a sensitivity label, applying protection, and then being able to apply other controls based on that label remains the same. It's just a branding change.
So I was going to ask, with those changes, sometimes there are sort of functionality changes or a broader scope. So if you think about where something like an ADRMS was, or an Azure ADRMS years and years and years ago, like how it sounds like fundamentals are still the same, but how much has the sort of product and platform shifted over those years?
I think what's happened is the labeling and the protection stack have sort of become a requirement, and rather than being an afterthought in a lot of cases, they're just like a part of the platform now. So you'll see across DLP and you'll see across Power BI and Office and SharePoint, all these things now kind of support labeling as a first-class citizen. Like customers expect it. It's a predicate for DLP policies and applying protection on download from SharePoint and all of these things. And so what we've really seen is that it's more ubiquitous. Customers can configure it everywhere, and they can use it to label and protect content across their organization.
Yeah. Cool. So what do you do with the Microsoft Purview Information Protection team? Like what's your sort of primary focus these days?
So I'm a principal product manager in the team. Like I said, I've been involved with the rights management service for about 7, 8 years. Today I own the SDK. So all of our dev platform story around the labeling experience, which includes MIP SDK, which we have C++, .NET. We have a Java wrapper and preview. And then we also have a set of graph APIs that I don't think we'll get to today, but that covers a subset of our MIP SDK functionality. And then really anything dev platform related, like helping customers to prioritize what we do next, what languages we invest in, what platforms we invest in, and that kind of thing. And there's a bit of other work that I do that's not related to that.
So when it comes to MIP SDK, so this is a way, or really I guess sort of dev platform in total for MIP. I mean, this is really a way for me as a customer, me as an ISV who's selling software to my customers. Like who's your primary, or maybe a better question would be like, what sort of things can I do with these SDKs and APIs?
So we started off really targeting ISVs, and we worked with a bunch of DLP vendors at the beginning, because we really felt like the concern around encrypted content is that I still want my DLP product to be able to inspect it outbound, or my mail gateway to inspect it outbound. So we worked with some DLP vendors 4 or 5 years ago to build some integrations with them. And what it allows them to do, and this is one scenario that's pretty common, is to decrypt that content in transit and then inspect it, so they can make sure that I'm not leaking sensitive information. And then they can do the other part of that inbound, which is decrypt it and make sure that the content is not full of malware or something. So that's one scenario. Others are, and I'll demonstrate this in a bit here, is our integration with Adobe. So we've shipped really 2 main integrations with both Adobe Reader and Adobe Acrobat, which is I can again consume that protected content and render an encrypted PDF in Reader, or I can apply a label. So I'm just like I can do in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, I'm authoring something in Adobe Acrobat. I can select a label. That label then drives content marking, drives encryption, applies metadata to the content, so that I can ensure that the things that I'm creating at the beginning, or from the beginning rather, are encrypted if they need to be. And then we're starting to really see a big uptick in customer line of business applications. So if I have line of business apps that are generating CSV or text files, or PDFs are another big one. Today, customers will do something where they have to downstream either rely on DLP to protect that, or they have to have some other process protect that information, or they just don't. It's just generating invoices in PDF format, and they're not protected at all. So what we're seeing a lot of customers do is use the SDK to integrate with those line of business apps to actually label the content at creation. So that PDF gets created, and I know that it contains social security numbers, for example. We'll apply a label, it's encrypted, and now I have to have an identity that's authorized to actually view that content. So that's another big one we're seeing.
And so the integration with systems like DLP systems, presumably, makes that categorization of what kind of data is in there a little bit easier, so those labels can be applied, maybe even if the user completely forgot to, or if they actively did not label that content, we can get an extra layer of protection to make sure it gets labeled, or through via these DLP systems or similar, I assume.
Yeah, there's a couple paths there. A lot of the DLP vendors, Microsoft included, have their own or our own classification stack. So you're exactly right. We would decrypt the content, perform some classification to identify sensitive information that's in there, and then within the MIP label, you can actually apply a label that you can apply rules that say if it contains 10 social security numbers, apply this label to the content. And so that's a pretty common use case for both internal Microsoft products like Office and our DLP, as well as third-party DLP products. Unfortunately, we don't have the SDK itself has sort of a classification interface, but it's more of a, you tell us what you found and we'll tell you the label to apply. So we don't actually have any tech baked into it that will perform the classification for you. But if you've done it on your own and mapped it to our labels, we'll tell you what the label should be.
Well, that's the function of the DLP system in question anyway, right? Is to do the actual classification, and then the figuring out of which label. It sounds more like a business question more than anything else, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose then too, the function of encryption is really a matter of encryption is the most reliable way to make sure that the people who receive your content, only the people who you intend to see it, manipulate it, edit it, whatever. Mm-hmm. That's really, I guess, the function of this encryption. And we kind of had a question about this too from one of the viewers, from our friend Sean. He mentions that you need access this PDF both at rest and then also to go and open and read it, or whatever piece of content it is. Presumably, once these labels have been applied, that there's nobody else is going to look at that content at all unless they're one of the intended recipients. Is that fair?
Yeah. So we like to say that the encryption scheme is like an identity-based encryption, because it does rely on Azure Active Directory. I need to have an identity. I need to be authorized. And assuming you're one, authenticated, and you pass all the authorization barriers, conditional access and other things, at that point you'll be granted access to the document.
Nice.
So yeah. So labeling. Sorry.
Years and years ago. I feel like I remember that from years and years ago, back maybe when it was still called ADR RMS, of going to a portal and seeing I remember seeing you could see who had opened a document and where they had opened it, and it was a neat interface. I guess maybe I don't talk about things that are safe enough to classify, so I don't use it very frequently myself, but. That's awesome. I mean, I imagine it's only going to increase in the number of folks who need to do this sort of thing, and the need to have it be as transparent and seamless as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's been the key for us over the years, has been making it easier and easier, both making it easier for users to understand and apply the labels, and then also making it easier for the system to automatically apply the labels. So kind of both of those things, and then at the end, forcing users to apply a label if they don't. So we have a mandatory labeling setting that if I forget to apply the label, it will prompt me to do that, which is pretty common in customer environments. Customer environments where they want to make sure docs and emails and things get labeled.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see why. So when it comes to the kinds of content that can be protected, is this, at least in terms of where MIP sits, is this purely document-based, file-based stuff? Are there emails or content that's online in other places? What kind of content can I protect with MIP?
Generally speaking, today it's around primarily focused on documents and emails. Technically speaking, we can protect anything.
Sure.
It's a question of, do we have a parser? So I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook have all done work over the years to integrate with our SDKs and kind of natively support that. And the file formats natively support our encryption scheme. So somebody can read the spec, they can write their own parser, and they could build their own interpretation of that if they needed to for like a third-party Office client, for example. Excuse me. If we have like CAD files, this is a great example. We can support CAD files today. We have like a generic encryption scheme we call pfile that just encrypts the whole file as one big blob and then sticks it into this thing we call pfile. So we would rename it like file.dwg.pfile. The problem there is that it's not natively consumable in CAD applications, right? So I can't double click that in AutoCAD or whatever my CAD client happens to be and view that. So when we want to onboard new file types, there's generally some work with partners. PDF is a great example. We worked with Adobe and some others over the years to standardize that. So when we want to do new formats, we have to go to whoever owns that, partner with them, build a parser, and then add that native integration. But that said, you can protect any type of file. We see customers that protect images, CSV files, and then it is possible with our SDK to even do things like build support for encrypting data in a SQL database. You could use our protection SDK. You can encrypt buffers of bytes, store the license information somewhere, and do that same thing. So it's all just a question of like the application and what you're trying to protect and how deep you're willing to go with it.
Yeah, no, that last one's kind of interesting. It's put a giant exclamation point above my head of using it before you're writing out to storage. That's an interesting. Have you seen anyone do that like for real, like as a production style solution to something, or is it more of a theoretical at this point?
We did some POCs. I haven't seen anybody do it at scale across like an Azure service or like a Cosmos DB or anything like that. A good example of like a non-file type is actually Edge. So if you're familiar with the state roaming feature where I can sign into any browser and download all my stuff and I don't have to migrate my bookmarks around and whatnot, that is protected by our SDK. So Edge takes all that data, your passwords and all that stuff, puts it into this file, and then uses they're actually using a key on the device to encrypt that, and then they use our SDK to encrypt the encryption key. So they're just using us as the encryption key service that gets put up into their backend, wherever that lives. And then when I go to the next device, it downloads all that, uses my identity to decrypt it, and then I can get all my bookmarks and things. So they're a pretty good example of like a not file type that's done something interesting.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I never would have guessed. So and it's cool to know that state roaming is protected one way or another. So that's super neat. So cool. So what have you got to show us? I hear you've got some neat apps. You've got some neat things that you've been working on, and let's dig in. Let's take a look.
Yeah. So I've got a. Let me share my screen here and get my VM up.
Mr. Mark, I'll just call him Mark because I don't know if anyone actually knows how to pronounce his last name. He's shouting for demos in the chat, so I suppose we have to, as early as it is.
Try this. All right, so I've got my screen shared here. Uh-oh, except my VM is not responding.
It's okay. It's effectively a Monday morning for the U.S. At least it certainly feels like one. Yesterday, I got emails from people, and I'm thinking, okay, I get it. Everybody's got a lot of work to do. But I feel like if you're a U.S. employee doing work yesterday, save your email to send till this morning because nobody wants a reminder that some people are still deciding to go to work yesterday. Let's keep that to ourselves. Anyway, okay. So we got our VM. Let's get your VM up here. So very cool. Okay.
All right. So I guess the first thing we'll look at real quick is this Adobe integration that I mentioned. So this is Adobe Acrobat, the paid professional license for authoring PDFs. And real quick, we'll just create a new PDF here. It's a blank one. Oh, wait, no, not that one. This one's the blank one. And I'm really bad at using this, so I'm going to forget where everything's at.
It's okay. I don't know if I've ever actually seen a paid-for version of anything Acrobat. So this is all new for me.
Yeah, we actually we partnered with the Adobe folks for quite a while. We've been working with them on the initial Acrobat integration for Reader to just support reading protected PDFs for a long time, and then we worked with them on bringing this actual publishing experience into Acrobat for the last year and a half, and this shipped sometime in the fall.
Neat. All right.
So, and there's all sorts of integration. I can convert my docx to a PDF and all of that. And then in this case, now I'm working on this PDF and I see that, maybe I need to label this based on my organizational policies. So I can just click up here under select a Microsoft sensitivity label, which is under their protect menu. And it's going to show me their labeling interface. And now I can say just confidential all employees, apply that label, and it's going to ask me to save it now. Say entitled. So I've actually created an encrypted PDF. You can see here it says that it's applied the label as confidential all employees. If I dig into the protection settings over here and look at permission details, it'll show somewhere, that the label is applied, and then shows me any of the restrictions. Now I'm the owner of this document, so I don't have any restrictions. But if somebody else sent me this PDF, then I would see like things I can't do, like copy content, for example, and Acrobat would block that from happening.
So the things that are here in Acrobat, they have an analog in our own policies that we create, or they're specific. Like when I'm creating, if I want to create a policy, do I have these explicit things for Acrobat, or do they fall under like a broader, content management style policy of not being able to copy content or whatever? Like how do these restrictions get translated from Purview?
So they're all actually defined, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, but of course, here we go. Okay. So we can define these as part of the labels. Let me zoom in a bit. And if I look at, these are the stock ones for our demo tenants that are configured, and I can drill into this confidential all employees. And of course, my session's expired. That's what I get for prepping everything last night.
But we want to make sure and give lots of permanence to the Azure AD login screen to all of our customers and employees and viewers. So,
all right, let's refresh this. So while this is going, so I'll come into here as the admin, and this is what my label taxonomy looks like. So these are totally customizable. Organizations can throw all these away and build their own. We see customers that have anywhere from 2 to 3 up to hundreds of labels. We generally don't recommend hundreds of labels. It's difficult to manage, difficult to scope. But there are valid use cases, like every country has to have their own rules or something. And we see that from time to time.
And then, okay, cool. Here we go.
So I can edit the label. I can configure the display name. Like this is what users will see. This is localizable. I think you have to do it through PowerShell. A description, label color, and I can scope the label and say where this applies. So items refers to all these things: emails, Office files, Power BI items. We can also apply it to groups and sites like M365 groups, Teams, and SharePoint. And then we can start to do some stuff with Microsoft Purview data map. So applying these labels and mapping these labels to all my schematized things across Azure workloads.
Oh, that's neat. I'm not familiar with, I'm certainly not like a Purview pro, probably not even a novice. So that there's even a thing called data map, I find very interesting. So that's cool. Okay.
And then we can get into what are the settings for the labeled items. So apply, remove encryption. We can do content marking like header, footer, watermark. And then protect Teams meetings and chats. We will skip. Okay. So getting back to your question, this is where we start to define the encryption settings. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here that we can talk about, but the important thing is the permissions. So what I can do here is my tenant has this MIP SDK demo, which is my tenant name. defined under users and groups, which I guess isn't a user or group, it's the actual tenant. So everybody in my organization would have co-author permissions to that PDF that I just showed you. Now, if I want to trim this down, I can add somebody else and maybe add a different organization. So maybe I would want to say contoso.com. And I would add
Interesting.
Contoso.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this would say Contoso is my partner organization. I trust that anybody in their organization can decrypt that content. And we can do it also by users and groups. And now here's going back to your question. What those rights look like in Acrobat. So I can trim this down and say viewer. So if I were to send this to somebody at Contoso and they open it up, they would only have these 3 rights: this view rights data, and object model, which means they can't print, they can't copy, they can't edit, none of that stuff. And we can control that as an encryption outcome at the labeling level.
So then when Acrobat looks at that label to determine what rights an individual user might have, they essentially get translated into whatever those document restrictions are, that Acrobat allows to be applied to a PDF. It essentially translates those over into something that Acrobat can essentially enforce, because Acrobat is the enforcer here at this point, right? Like once the user signed in and the content is decrypted, it's up to Acrobat to then enforce those content restrictions, I assume, since it's on that file.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the differences between our approach to the rights management story and maybe some of our competitors, in that we rely on integration because we think it's cleaner, it's easier to manage. A lot of times you'll see like an agent or something that has to be installed on the machine, which adds complexity, adds risk. It's harder to guarantee, harder to manage. And so we just say, like, look, if you're an enlightened application, come work with us. Here's how to become an enlightened application. And this is how you enforce all the rights management. So if an application, for example, we'll pick on Office just because it's internal. Let's say Office forgets to enforce one of these things. It's possible that I could copy something and then we would file a bug on Office, or customers would notice and file a bug on Office, and then we would fix it. Thankfully, that doesn't happen, but that's just an example of the application owner needing to enforce those controls.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. That's neat. It's an interesting sort of model, because like the agent model is the one I guess I'm most familiar with from years ago, from places I've worked in over time. And yeah, it's not very nice. It's not very clean, and it never really worked. So it's neat to see. And I guess in some ways, does that limit how you approach like the SDK itself, and what kinds of partners get different levels of access? I mean, presumably, if I was to go build my own application for viewing PDFs, could I just build one that just doesn't enforce any of the rules? Like, how's that handled, I guess?
So we have what's called the Information Protection Integration Agreement, or the IPIA, which is like in order to ship something outside of your organization, like to make a product to sell to customers, you have to sign this agreement. And the agreement says, we'll do the right thing. We'll enforce these controls. We're not going to break anything. If somebody finds that our application is not enforcing the controls, we'll fix it. So it's just an agreement between us and the partner to ship a product that does the right thing.
Okay. And like you said, it's only for externally shipping apps. So things that are internal, LOB, I mean, I don't know why you would want to sabotage yourself, but you could, I guess, presumably internal apps can do whatever internal apps need to do to get the job done, which I suppose is also good if you're in development, right? And be able to test and sort of see exactly what's going on. Okay, cool. Sorry. Okay. Neat.
The other part of this that's worth mentioning, which I think is more important around the agent versus native integration, is that B2B collaboration, when you're talking about having an agent, is really hard. If somebody sends me a protected document and says, oh, by the way, run this executable and install it on your system to consume my content. Yeah, I'm probably not going to do that. So having the native app integration with Adobe and an Office and Power BI and all these other applications is really important to making sure that, like, I don't have to install anything else on my system.
Yeah, no, that's a that's a great point because nothing's Cause we train users. We've been telling users for 30 years, don't open things that people send you in emails, especially if they're applications. Like it's almost guaranteed to be dangerous, and then we can't very well tell them, by the way, you need to go download this random executable with a randomly generated name, no less, like you're trying to join the Zoom meeting or something. So
Yeah.
very cool. Okay, cool. Got it. So this is ultimately the place where I, as an admin, I'm going to come in and say, hey, these are the restrictions, like at sort of a logical level. And then it's up to each one of my applications to go and translate that into like an actual enforcement based on sort of the interpretation of the spirit of that rule.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
cool.
Cool.
And our docs define like what the rules mean and what they should do with each right.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yep.
I guess while we're here, so there's labeling policies as well. So I mentioned organizations that might have hundreds of labels. They would probably have 100 or more of these label policies, and these just define which sets of labels get deployed to which users in the organization. So like this one, for example, is going to everybody in my org. Well, maybe I have a top secret project that only 5 people should have access to. I would define a label for that project, define a label policy for that project, and then deploy it to just the members of that team.
Very cool.
So we can scope labels across the organization. And then finally, we won't really get into this. And I don't have any configured. We can create the auto labeling rules that I mentioned earlier. So like this is applying sensitivity labels to email, SharePoint, OneDrive files based on contents. So looking for
okay, cool. And is
Go ahead.
Is that related to DLP, or are they sort of wholly separate at this point? Like, are those two separate sort of functions, I guess, at this point?
They're separate. DLP is more data in motion, so accessing something, and moving something around, and this is looking for files that are, or could be looking for files at rest, or maybe I'm, if it's configured as part of my label, I'm accessing that Office document or that Word document, and it contains something that triggers one of these labels. It could suggest that I apply or automatically apply the label to the content at that time. So, I think cool. DLP has some integration here, but I'm not super familiar with it.
Okay, no, that's cool. And this is, I'm looking at this here, and this really, the auto labeling, I know we don't want to dig into it too much, but this is sounds like it's a very sort of like Microsoft and service-based functionality. Is this something that I have control over or can leverage inside of the SDK, or is this primarily like an Office and SharePoint style thing for auto labeling here?
We have some SDK interfaces that will allow you to resolve, how do I put this? To resolve the correct label based on the classification result, but the SDK can't perform any classification. So by that, I mean,
got it.
You can't pass us some bytes and say, hey, find me all the social security numbers in here. It's just, we don't have any APIs to let you do that.
Okay, makes sense. Cool, got it.
All right. So maybe jump over to the sample app and pray to the demo gods that it actually runs today.
Okay, Sean asked a question here, so really quickly sort of address it. So he says he asks if this is integrating with Purview for classification and classification and tagging, and this is Purview. I mean, this is I assume one of the core parts of Purview, right?
Depends. So Purview is actually 2 different products. So we had like Microsoft Information Protection was our kind of previous brand, and then there was Azure Purview, and we've merged into kind of the same umbrella. If you're referring to like Purview data governance on the Azure resource side of things, there's not really any integration here outside of some basic just label mapping. And then on the other side is mostly on the productivity side of things.
Okay. Wait a minute. So we use the same name for like 4 different things that are sort of related? Microsoft would never do that.
2 different things. Yeah, 2 different things.
Oh, 2 different things. Okay.
And they are related. I mean, they're both solving kind of the same things, just for different areas. So it's yeah, they're under the same umbrella because they're really about compliance and data governance.
So So while you're getting your sample app up, I've got one more quick question. So for in terms of licensing to be able to use this, and specifically around like the demo tenants that customers can go out and grab, and we'll put the link up here at the bottom for anyone who's interested in going to go get one. Is this a license that's like included in one of the M365 suites, or is there something extra to purchase? Or if I'm a dev and I've got a dev tenant, will I have this sort of stuff accessible to me to start?
Yeah, the M365 E3 or AIP, Azure Information Protection P1, which is our legacy license for buying AIP, both allow you to use the SDK and all the link interfaces and everything. Yeah, so like I think you can get like a developer subscription that comes, I want to say it's like an E5 subscription with just a couple licenses, maybe one. You can totally spin one of those up if you don't have one already, and use the SDK against, and set up all the labeling and use the SDK against that.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
I think I'll have to check out the actual dev subscription.
Well, they've gotten the dev subscriptions have gotten better. They're basically like M365 E5 or M5, but it's 25 licenses. I think the only part of it doesn't include is the Windows licensing that comes along with M5.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is part of that. These aren't separate SKUs, separate licenses outside of M365 stuff. Okay, cool.
Yep. Yeah. And then, I guess speaking of licensing, the SDK itself is MIT licensed, so you're pretty permissive. You can kind of use it wherever you want.
Cool. Okay.
There. All right. So this is the sample application. I can follow up with the link. It's out in GitHub. This version's not quite there yet, but and this is meant to show what a customer line of business application might look like. So you can see we've got this employee data menu, data import, file services, and security policy. So we'll start on the security policy tab, and I'll go through each of these, and then maybe we'll dive into the code and talk about how each section works. And so a common pattern we'll see, in SharePoint, line of business apps, is that if there's this concept that a data that lives inside a service or inside a trusted boundary that I control, we refer to as being inside the trust boundary. And in most cases, we would say it's probably okay to remove encryption from that if you need to. So SharePoint Online is a great example of this. If I have protected co-authoring turned on, I label a PDF on my machine, or I'm sorry, an Office document on my machine, and encrypt it. When it gets sent up to SharePoint, the encryption gets removed, and it gets stored plain text in SharePoint, which enables a bunch of stuff like protected co-authoring. So now somebody else can come along, open that document, edit it in the web, edit it locally, and it's a seamless experience. Probably one of my favorite features we've shipped in the last few years as far as the encryption stuff goes. So we say the data is in the trust boundary, remove protection. That's not always going to be the case. There's some services, maybe I want to put this out into an Azure blob and I don't want to remove the protection because I want to make sure it's encrypted in case somebody gets access to that blob. But we can define rules that would both restrict the label that can ingress so that I can upload to the system, and reapply the protection on download. So what this security policy is demonstrating is this download policy, which says, if somebody downloads something from the system, apply this label to it. So no matter what, if it was encrypted at upload, if it wasn't encrypted at upload, it's going to apply this label. And we can configure that here. So this is all being fetched by the SDK, populated in this control, and I can set the label that gets applied on download.
Cool. Okay. So and just to be clear, when you said that something was in plain text, you mean doesn't have MIP encryption applied to it, like all of the existing cloud service encryption that happens on data and disks and everything in the data centers is still applicable. We're only talking about MIP encryption, correct?
Yeah, we're talking about like data at rest in the service is encrypted, but we're saying if somebody has access to the API and can pull that data down, they're getting
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Just I don't want that. I don't want somebody. So Microsoft says they store your SharePoint documents in plain text. It's like so. Okay. Just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So we typically refer to the protection as traveling with the document. In this case, that's what we mean is like we remove that protection that travels with the document, and we just store a document that anybody could open. So then we'll configure an upload policy, and this is going to say that files that are more sensitive than this can't be uploaded. So maybe I have just a generic or a public SharePoint site or line of business app that anybody has access to. Well, I want to make sure nobody's going to upload files that are too sensitive for that site, because I don't necessarily restrict that site as much as I should. So I can set a policy here that maybe prohibits adding more sensitive information or prohibits less sensitive information, whatever I want to do. So now that I've defined the security policy, I can go over here to the employee data tab, and I've got just this, pretend this is an HR system with a bunch of salaries and things. We'll click this export button. So it tells me here, based on my policy, that when I download this file, it's going to apply this confidential all employees label.
Okay. And what kind of restrictions do you have on that label? Is it just a default out of the box one, or?
Yeah, that one's pretty default. It's just my entire organization has full control to it. And we could go in and configure something that maybe is a little more restricted.
Sure. Okay. I'm thinking like HR systems where it's like, hey, like, please include the salary info, which might have a higher protection level than, say, title and hire date. Something like that, right?
Yeah, for sure. You could even start to map business logic to say, if the report contains this, then make it this sensitivity. So there's, this is a relatively broad and kind of static approach, but you could make it more dynamic, where based on the column I'm showing or who has access to what, apply a different label to it.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Neat.
We actually have a partner that does something similar with SAP called Secure. They make a product called Halo Core, and they can go in and configure based on whatever I'm looking at in SAP. I won't pretend to understand SAP very well, but if I'm exporting certain data, depending on the sensitivity the admin's assigned to that object, it will apply the label and download.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, interesting. And that's called Halo Core? That's the name of the partner or the name of their product?
The product's called Halo Core. The partner is Secure. SECUDE.
Okay, cool. Halo Core sounds sort of like a metal band that's also into video gaming. I don't know, but I do like the name.
And they have a product called Halo CAD that does the same thing for a bunch of different CAD products.
Ah, neat. Okay, good to know.
So if I click export here, we'll show this, then maybe we can go dive into the code and start from the beginning. It creates this employee data Excel sheet, and I open that up.
One of our viewers, Fuel's a longtime friend of the show, says that believes SAP might make SharePoint look simple. I think I would agree there. Like, being a bit of a SharePoint dev refugee myself, I would agree that I think SAP is probably much easier or much more complex and confusing than even SharePoint and all of its XML madness. So, sorry, continue.
Yeah, I've never looked, and maybe I can get to the next 13 or 14 years without way beyond me. So we generated this Excel sheet, and it's got this employee data in here. We can see right away that it's applied the encryption. It says all employees. I can view permission. Now, I'm the owner, so I'll have full control of this. Oh, no, I'm not the owner of this one. I exported it, so I don't have full control. The system generated this document rather than me.
Okay.
And so you can see I don't have the export right, and I don't have full control. But I can copy and print and edit and all that other stuff.
Okay.
This machine has the Azure Information Protection Client installed. So if I click show bar, you can see that we've got this classification bar. We can jump over to Word in a bit, and I'll show you what the native experience looks like inside of Office now. Eventually, this will go away. We won't have an AIP client anymore. Office has a native labeling experience that's going to replace AIP, and we would encourage customers to move to that native labeling experience if you're not already deploying AIP, just because that's the future.
So if I would go to, if I'm in Word or one of these, if I go to File, I think it's like in the Backstage view or whatever it's called, I feel like there was I'm not a very good employee. I don't know what all the things inside of all of our Office products are called, but in here, I felt like at some point there's a way for me to apply or add a protection policy. I feel like I've done this somehow in Word before, but I don't know. I've applied one of our policies like by name or whatever, but I don't know how I've done it. Now looking at your screen, I don't think I've done it the way I thought I did it. So maybe it's no big deal, but.
Yeah, this is where, so back in the Azure RMS days, this is where users had to go. So like, there was this sort of mystery for a while, like, wow, why is nobody using Azure Rights Management? And security people loved it, and everybody thought it was a great idea, but users didn't use it. And it was because I had to click, like, I used to joke about this a bunch. As a user who's just writing my document, I have to click File, Info, where's this thing? Oh, Protect Workbook, Restrict Access. Okay, and then I get this list. Now which one do I pick? And there were no tool tips or anything. And that was really one of the reasons we ended up building AIP and acquiring Secure Islands, was the labeling interface being right in front of the user made a lot more sense than this 8 clicks I had to do to get there.
Okay.
But you're totally right. That's where it used to be. When the labeling's turned on, we hide all of the templates, so you don't see that list anymore. But yeah.
Oh, okay.
This replaced all that. So now, as a user, I click confidential, all employees, and hey, I'm done.
Very nice. Okay. And that's happening locally. Like, this isn't saved to SharePoint. Like, this is just a machine or this is just an Excel sheet that's on your machine. Yeah. And now it's already protected. So if you were to accidentally send that to someone who shouldn't see it, who isn't an employee, doesn't meet that criteria, they wouldn't be able to see, they wouldn't be able to open this document. That's what I'm hearing, right?
Yep. Yeah. The example I like to use is, we all send emails to the wrong people once or twice,
Sure.
or I maybe lose my thumb drive in the parking lot. I don't know if people still use thumb drives, but if somebody gets access to that data either way, and it's inaccessible.
Yeah. Okay,
something
cool.
I like to use this for is maybe I'm in an email with one group of people who are external, and I need to have an internal conversation. I'll apply a label to make sure nobody re-adds somebody to the conversation that shouldn't be re-added. So you can use it to prevent maliciously sending out data, accidentally sending out data.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Years ago, I worked with a lady, and she had a USB drive that was in the shape of a thumb, like a literal thumb, and she painted the nail to give it a little bit of flair. So, okay, cool. And then presumably, the Fuel is asking about zip disks, like iOmega zip drives. I imagine. Presumably. As long as the file's stored somewhere and it's already been protected, I imagine you could probably put it onto a zip disk. Although a zip disk in 2023 might be the equivalent of like driving a stick, like a manual transmission, like it's the best anti-theft out there. Because if nobody can read your iOmega zip drive, then no one can steal the data that's on it.
Nobody's
encrypted or not. Yeah.
Do you need a SCSI card for zip drive?
Oh my God, what year is it? This is I feel like we need like a sepia tone and some scan lines going through here now.
It's funny. Cool. So maybe now what we'll do is...
let's see how you did this.
Yeah, I'll set a breakpoint here. So maybe let's talk about the app first. All over the place. So this is an ASP.NET Razor application. I'm not going to pretend to be an MVC or Razor expert at all. I built this mostly based on sample code and kind of hacked it all together. It works, surprisingly. But what we'll focus on really is this MIP service here, which is where all of most of the core of the MIP SDK integration is at. And then there's this auth delegate we'll talk about briefly. So if we look at under pages here, I've got this employee data. So that's the screen we were just looking at with that table. And all that is there's no actual document behind that at the beginning. It really is just a table that's reading from a SQLite database. And if I look at code here, we've got this on post export. So when I click that export button, this is what happens. And maybe what I'll do is just set the breakpoint and we can walk through this. If I can find the right window. Okay. So I mentioned we set this download policy. And what this is going to first do is check to make sure that I have a download policy set, because out of the box, when I first set this app up, there's no policy defined, and we want to make sure that we don't throw an error. Oops, should not have done that. One second. Okay. So we're going to say, all right, I've got a policy defined. Now, what's my label ID? So we look again at this min label ID for action. I've defined this data policy class that contains that. And all that's going to be is back here under security policy, where I defined this confidential all employees. It's saying any file that I download from this site needs to have that label applied. And so this is my label ID. So the next thing I do is generate a table from all that employee data. So there's this, I can't remember which library I use. There's a NuGet package that can generate this based just on an input of some IEnumerable. Pass that in, and I get this Excel stream back. We're going to skip that. It's kind of out of scope. Now we'll apply the MIP label. So what I'm doing is passing in, I have this method that I've created called apply MIP label. It takes in a stream, takes in my label ID, which again, I've defined as part of my policy, and then a file name. We're just going to call it employee file XLSX. And so we'll,
okay. No, sorry. The cleaning folks are here, so I went on mute for a minute because the vacuum was loud. So, okay.
So now
so this is our thing that's going to apply our label, and at this point now, this is where we're getting into the actual MIP. The MIP SDK is being wrapped by this, right?
Yep. Yeah. So this is my service class that's going to handle all the MIP integration, to kind of make it a lot easier for me just to pass in files, pass in a stream, pass in a label, pass in a file name, and you'll get whatever labeled stream back out of it. And then I just have to write the stream wherever it needs to go. So you can see here, we've included like the MIP SDK, both file and protection. We've got some setup stuff that we do up here that we can walk through. And then each of these functions. So you can see I've got like the supply MIP label, which is where we're at, or maybe, I'll skip that one. Get default label. So I mentioned that you can have a default or mandatory label. So this method would return my default label for a specific user.
Cool.
I can read a label. So we can go through each of these as we have time. Let's check on this one. So first thing we need to do, we have, I talked about this last time I was on the show, which is there's this set of classes, MIP context, MIP profile, and MIP engine, which are effectively different layers of how we bootstrap an application with MIP. So MIP context and MIP profile kind of set up at an application level. What do you support? What do you do? Where should I write my cache? Where should I write my logs? All that kind of stuff. Probably the engineering is probably going to say there's a whole bunch more that happens behind the scenes, but we'll ignore that. And then after I've bootstrapped all that stuff, next thing I do is create an engine. And an engine is where things start to happen. And by that, I mean, I'm going to authenticate. I need to get a token. I need to have a user identity at that point, or a service principal, because we're going to fetch policy. And so the engine is really the important scope as far as like when I'm going to start to do things, and when I need user identity. So
I wanted to ask you that question too, is around the identity. So you'd mentioned earlier that the app was the owner of one of the ones that was signed earlier, but there's also some delegated ops in here, and so we can get to it when you're ready. I'm really curious to understand more about the delegated versus app users here.
Yeah, we can, after we run through this, maybe we can jump into the Azure portal and take a look at the configuration. So this app will create an engine. Now, well, we'll come back to that. So the first thing I need to do is create this file engine settings. And this is going to define a bunch of things as far as like, which cloud am I a part of? What types of applications do I support? So I might say, what kind of labels do I support? So one thing we haven't talked about yet is our double key encryption. And double key encryption allows a customer to deploy our DKE service in their infrastructure, And effectively, we double encrypt the licensing component of the file to say that the only way to decrypt this file is to call back into my on-prem or my Azure hosted service to get this additional key to decrypt the content, which effectively prevents, it gives the customer complete control of the encryption keys, and it prevents Microsoft from decrypting the content. Customers generally use that for super sensitive information. They don't want it to be in the cloud. They don't want it to be, for example, I can't use Office web apps. I can't use OA. It can never be journaled. It can never be indexed. And customers have a subset of data where they use that DKE service. So here is where I would define and say, I support that. I can,
okay.
I would configure this functionality filter and say, oh, I support DKE labels. Give me the DKE labels. By default, we just filter those out.
Okay.
So the engine settings are where I can configure just things about my file engine that are outside of the defaults. Kind of all over the place with this. The locale, my endpoints as far as like where I'm going to connect to the service. We have them by default. People can override them though if they need to. Primarily though, it's going to be these label filters and the functionality. So once I create the file engine settings, now I can actually add the file engine. So there's this, again, going back to our hierarchy of the classes that we have, I've created this file profile object already, and I'll just call add engine async, and I pass in this settings object. And at that point, it's going to call the policy service. It's gonna authenticate the user. It's going to fetch policy. And then I'll have something that I can use now to actually start doing some operations as the user.
Okay.
So we'll skip ahead here. We'll go back. So now engine's created, I've authenticated, I've fetched my user policy. So my labels are actually there and kind of in memory somewhere. The next thing I need to do is create a handler, and a handler, each of our SDKs, so MIP SDK is actually 3 SDKs that have different functionality: File SDK, Policy SDK, and the Protection SDK. This application is using our File SDK because it's handling file input and output. Each of those has a specific handler. So in this case, you can see we create this iFile handler because I'm working with the File SDK. We use that engine we created for the user, and we effectively create a handler that's in the context of that user for a given file or stream. So I pass in this input stream, which if we go back, it's that Excel file I created. I pass in a file name that I want to give it. And then here, I think as if I generated a discover event. I can't remember what that parameter was. Yeah. So if I want to generate a discover event, and we can talk about our auditing experience here if we have some time.
Well, we have a question about that too, so I'll save the question for when we talk about auditing. Okay. So just a couple moments. So Christopher looks like who's in the chat. We'll get there in just a minute.
Okay. So at this point, I'll create this file handler, which is going to let me do stuff on the file. And in this case, we're applying a label. So we create the handler. I should see that it's created. It's got an output file name. If I were to drill in over here, I would hopefully see some other stuff. The next thing I can do is create this labeling options, which just specifies really a few things about the item. The assignment method, which is auto, privileged, or standard, which really defines, did a user apply a label to this or did a process apply a label to this? Generally speaking, we want to make sure that an automated process doesn't override a user because we trust a user's judgment, which may be a mistake, more than an automated process. So we don't want to accidentally overwrite things where we shouldn't. If a label is being downgraded, if my admin requires me to provide justification, if I'm going from confidential to public, sometimes I need to provide justification. So I can provide that justification message here. And if the downgrade is justified, if that's required and I don't provide that, we'll throw an exception and I have to handle that exception, ask the user to provide it, and then continue.
Hang on just one second. So we just got a bunch of folks. Welcome, all of our raiders from Mr. Fritz. Glad everybody's here. So, I mean, is it really a raid without an air horn? So, welcome everyone. We've got Mr. Moser here from the Microsoft Purview Information Protection team, who's talking to us about the .NET SDK for protecting files. So welcome. Hope you all were having fun with Mr. Fritz. Always nice to see his viewers. And since I'm sure he was doing a bunch of Blazor and .NET, so if there's nothing else, if you wanted somebody to critique your Blazor, we now have 115 people who I'm sure will be happy to tell us everything we're doing wrong in Blazor. Because, I mean, for as long as I've watched Mr. Fritz, he does lots and lots of Blazor. So welcome, everybody. Glad you can come over and hang out. So if you want to make sure that people aren't swiping your data, or if you're even protecting yourself, so make sure that email that's full of expletives about your boss doesn't accidentally get sent to them. You can use a Purview Information Protection to help classify that data in a way to make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And we're just looking at an app that Tom has built around. Looking at an app that Tom's built around labeling that data, both going into systems, coming out of systems, and how you can start to integrate this with your own systems. So thanks. So sorry, Tom. Continue. I just wanted to welcome all of our new viewers and thank them for hanging out with us for a bit. So
yeah, no worries. We call that the "Do Not Forward" label.
The do not fire label. I mean, it works just in exactly the same way.
So I'll create these labeling options, and then now all I have to do is call set label in the handler, and I pass in my label ID, which again is defined, comes in as input to the apply MIP label method, and then gets passed in set label. I pass in my labeling options, and then there's this new protection settings. It's just empty. It doesn't actually have to have anything set unless I'm specifically needing to set some of those settings. I pass that in. And now when I get to that point, in memory, that handler has been labeled, but nothing's happened yet. I haven't actually committed it anywhere. So the last thing I need to do is call our commit async function, and I pass in my destination output stream. I know this isn't probably great async code, so if anybody has feedback, speaking of critiquing, feel free to create a PR and I will approve it very quickly. So I'll commit that change. Now at this point, when I commit the change, I actually have an output stream that was that Excel file that I gave as input with the label applied, including the protection and including the label metadata, and we'll return that. So now I return this back to the calling function, and we just return the file. So now my browser will, let's continue here. My browser will give me that download if I can find the right one. It didn't.
It may probably timed out because we have been talking. Like we had that request had been sitting there for a little while. But I mean, yeah, like returning the memory stream, and then that's the specific. I suppose that's a specific format or specific content type for what looks like an Excel sheet.
For Excel, yeah, yep.
So I had a question when you're doing and this kind of goes to the auditing question that we had from Christopher earlier. When we're doing that, one of the questions that was asked is around essentially sort of enforcing logging or enforcing like certain audit events to happen. And is that an administrative setting or something that we can do that sort of forces that configuration or overrides, say, a local app's configuration for how things happen? Like, I'm not super familiar with how logging and the auditing works here. So how would I be able to do that if there's a way to do that today to enforce that logging for it to happen? Yeah,
there's actually a setting that we have that's part of the labeling policy. So going back over here, I have to do it through PowerShell.
Okay.
But in this label policy, I can set a flag called enable audit, and MIP SDK automatically honors that. So what ends up happening in that scenario is there's both our audit portal here, which I won't generate. I can start a report. It just takes a few minutes. So I can dig through here and find labeling. Probably an easier view to look at just for now is this is our activity explorer. which shows me kind of the same information, just displayed in a little bit of a different way. And
Okay.
I'll see that this is the work that I was doing last night around the sample PDF. You can see this is the employee file that I was downloading. If I expand the scope here, maybe back a few days, and drill into some of these. Yeah, so here you can see I was doing a bunch of work with another application. And it tells us I generated this many labels. I found this many files. So a file discovered means I opened a labeled file. That's all it is. I read a label from a file that generated an audit event. Somebody changed a label, removed. So I can drill into this information and start to see stuff about, who's my user, where was the file on their machine that they opened,
right?
Where?
Because ultimately, I mean, if in order for me to open a file successfully, the application has to check in with the service, because the application doesn't have any keys on its own. So it's got to connect to the service in order to say, hey, user X is trying to open document B. I need to be able to do that, right?
Only for encrypted files. So encrypted files need to make a call back to the service, but we can label a file and have it be plain text. In that scenario, if somebody opens the file and they're a part of my organization, I'll see the event show up here. Okay,
that makes sense. And then does that also include, so label, I see label applied, for example, label removed. If I am a developer, and I'm assuming this is, I'm working under the assumption of a somewhat trustworthy developer, right? Like this isn't like contentious or unknown third-party type developers. If a developer was to protect a file through the SDK, if it's encrypted, there has to be a service callback in order for that to happen, and that's going to be logged, is what I'm hearing, right? Or in an audible way. Okay.
The encryption logs, like the access logs through the encryption side, don't show up here yet. We're doing some work to bring all that together. But there is, you can use a PowerShell commandlet. It's the AIP service PowerShell module. And there are some commandlets there that will allow you to download the service logs. They're like W3C style, look like IIS logs, that show you all that activity. So we're working on bringing all of that, enriching this data with those protection logs. But for now, you could use that PowerShell module, download those logs from the service, and you'd see that access event there.
Okay, that makes sense. And one more quick question before we move on from here. Sure. Sean asks, is there any sort of integration at the Azure policy side so that if I'm writing Azure policy, I can start to do any sort of enforcement to start to link these together, or sort of enforce certain settings, or are these pretty wholly separate from Azure policy?
They are pretty separate today. I'm not aware of any work that we're doing to bring those together.
Okay. Sean, if you don't mind, send us a note and let us know what that scenario might look like, and something we can forward on. So, sorry, continue.
All right. So going back, I guess just a quick summary on this. And this class is an example of how to do that in a service class. We just passed in some data, gave it a label, gave it a stream, or I could give it a file. And the resulting output was that I actually got something that's encrypted. And when I open that up, just going back to what I have here, again, open this up, and we'll see that it's got the label applied, confidential all employees. That happened at generation, at egress from my line of business application.
Very cool. And of course, that line of business app's running on a web server somewhere, some sort of a trusted system. And so, because the secrets that you need in order to do this, it looks like you've got, there's an Azure AD application registration. The secrets that are used, does the client actually do the encryption, or does the remote service encrypt the file and send it back? It looks like the app is doing it right here by writing the stream, right?
Yeah. So everything, the SDK does everything client side. So we will encrypt, decrypt the file locally. We've had some questions over the years and some feedback that's hey, I want the service to do this. But I imagine I take a 10, 20 megabyte PDF or Office doc, and now I have to upload 20 megs, download 20 megs, and it gets very, and then we have to handle that sensitive information on our service side. And so,
well, and security wise, the keys that you deal with are the keys, essentially the decryption keys, or the encryption keys are the things that are encrypted and I mean, of course, the entire document's encrypted, but the keys themselves are the things that are actually, decrypted, right? So then that gives us a little bit of, I guess, that gives us fast key roll and all sorts of things like that, right?
We don't support, so the way that our service actually encrypts documents is, I'll try to do a quick run through. When you deploy MIP, like you provision your tenant, we'll deploy like a default key for you. Optionally, customers can generate a key and put it into Azure Key Vault, which we call bring your own key. Overloaded term, I think. But so what happens when you protect a document is my device generates what we call a publishing license. And that publishing license has an AES key. So it's unique per document, per protected document. So that Excel sheet I created has its own unique AES key. What happens is the public key that I own, that I put into Azure Key Vault, gets used to protect parts of that, what we call a publishing license. So the publishing license contains things like who has rights to the file, what's the encryption key to the file, a few other things. And we encrypt that with the public key from the service, which means that only the private key in my service can decrypt it. We then use that content key that we generated to encrypt the document itself. And then we put all that together into a doc, and users don't know anything's different. Like you don't know it's a different file until you actually open it up. When I do the decryption, I pass that publishing license to the service. It first checks to see if I'm authenticated. If I am, it will unwrap that so the service can decrypt it, and it looks at the rights list and says, okay, is Bob in the rights list for this file or for this label? And if Bob is, then it issues what we call a use license that contains the actual content key, which then my device uses to decrypt the content.
Okay.
So I wish I had more than a hand wavy thing right now if my tablet was.
No, that's no. I mean, that's okay. No, it's great. I think that thinking about ways that, if customers are thinking about, if they're thinking about their own threat models, like having a good understanding and at least the first few steps of thinking through what that looks like, of what types of documents can be protected, how they can be protected, and the kinds of protection they're going to get, I think is pretty critical. Janisku, again, another one, the sort of longtime viewer, asks, if you encrypt your keys with hardware security keys, does that change anything? Like, is there anything locally that we're using TPMs or any sort of local hardware modules?
We don't use anything local on the device as far as TPM or anything. Yeah, it's all just in software today. We do support using like Azure Key Vault. You would use an HSM, so you generate your key with an HSM on-prem, and then you could upload that to Key Vault HSM backed. Yeah, as far as client devices, there's no hardware support today.
Okay, cool.
All right, so the other path here, going back to the labeling, would be uploading. So as a user, maybe I want to edit this file and re-upload it. We'll actually skip the editing part for now and just re-upload it to show what the policy looks like. So what I should be able to do here is go to my data import and choose file, and find that employee data sheet. And I didn't test this yesterday, so I don't know what's going to happen. It's been a while since I've actually tested this. And I'll submit this. And of course it failed.
That's all right.
So what should have happened here was, going back to the security policy, at upload time, we would just fetch the label from this. So if I look back into data import, we can see that. So I'm going to post this file, right? So we're just uploading this file. And the logic here is effectively, again, using that MIP API class that I built and saying first, is this file labeled or protected? If it's not labeled or protected, then it can't meet policy, and so we discard it. And then the next thing we'll do is just get the file label. And this, again, will look a little familiar as far as the pattern, right? Create an engine, create a handler, again, with an input stream and a file name, and generate that discovery event. And then all we do is just return handler.label. So again, the engine is in the context of the user. We do all the auth stuff there. And then the handler is just created for that particular file. And then we just return the label. So now my application can look at that label and say, all right, does the label, the sensitivity value of this label, is it greater than my security policy? And if it is, we don't permit that, so deny the upload. And if it's not, great, finish uploading it. And then that's where we jump ahead.
How is the label sensitivity defined? Is that defined in the server side, or is that a generally accepted level of sensitivity? How's that set?
Yeah, so we define that based on this order here. So, okay. And that this is a little misleading in that the behavior for while this shows 0 to 9, for child labels, they actually inherit the parent's sensitivity values. So these would all be 2. But it's based on the hierarchy from least sensitive is 0, most sensitive is whatever my top label is, whatever's the bottom of this list, rather. Yeah, so we can just very easily say, all right, is the sensitivity label value greater or less than, and then we can make some policy decisions based on that. So then we would say, let's say it did meet our policy, which this one did, which is through an exception. We would check to see is the file protected, and then there's a couple ways that we can remove protection from a file. One of them is just explicitly removing protection, and the other one is generating a temporary file. And they're both used for different use cases. So maybe we'll look at temporary first. So again, same pattern, create an engine, create a handler for that input stream. And then the next thing we want to do is, this goes back to the questions from the beginning about access checks and how do I decide what an app or a user can and can't do. We have this access check method where I can explicitly ask the SDK, does the user have rights to do this thing? And we've got this list here of all the different rights that we support in the SDK today. So in this case, I would want to make sure, does the user have the export right? And the export right would permit me to remove protection from a file. If they do, allow them to upload that data and decrypt it. And if not, then we throw an exception and say, sorry, you don't have rights to do this. And the goal there is, let's say I'm a user and I want to figure out how to see what's in a file or remove protection from a file. Well, if the service lets me just remove protection, I'll just upload it and then I can get the data plain text and download it. So the service has to check to see, should this user be able to do this thing? If not, deny it. So then now we're gonna get this temporary decrypted stream, and all that does is generates this. We don't get a file output. We're just gonna get a stream. Doesn't remove the label or anything, and it just gives me the plain text bytes as output. So now I can start to do something with those plain text bytes if I need to.
Okay.
The alternative to this is the remove protection API, which again, same setup, engine handler. Perform my access check here, which I realize now I did a little differently. And then call remove protection. This will generate a file output. So it's not intended to generate like a temporary file or a temporary stream. It's going to give me actually a file output. It's going to generate an audit event and say that, yes, somebody removed protection from this file.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing that you mentioned. So in the temporary case, is there no audit event that gets generated from that?
Right, we would see an audit event that somebody decrypted the file. We would see the access event would be in the logs that somebody did open the file, as far as the protection logs. But going back to the audit portal, we wouldn't generate any sort of event there because effectively, I'll give a concrete use case for that API. Let's open this up really quick. So if I open this sample PDF in, oh no, where is it? Okay. The AIP viewer. So the AIP viewer will generate a temporary file. So they don't call the get temporary stream. They call get temporary decrypted file. And what they do is fully decrypt this PDF into some temp file and then render it on the screen. So hopefully this works. Oh, there we go. There's my puppy. I needed something
nice. Is he new? Like, did you just get him, or?
He's 4 months old.
Wow. Well, congrats. I don't have a puppy. I have children, but I imagine you're quite busy. You have your hands full. So congrats.
Yeah, I don't know which is more work. So it generates that temporary file on disk. And then when I close this, it's going to clean it up all for me. Like the SDK handles that. The idea is that I'm not removing protection from this. I'm not generating an output. I'm just generating something temporary that the SDK will handle. And there's no intent for me to generate an actual plain text file that somebody's going to copy to my thumb drive and lose in the parking lot.
Okay, but, and I'm genuinely not trying to be obtuse. For the period of time this is open, there is a decrypted version of this somewhere in the machine that presumably I could go and grab out of temp or, whatever, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they actually write it to temp files or if they're putting it somewhere else. But in general, with any DRM solution, there's either a temp file or there's something in memory that if I'm persistent enough, I can find. We typically approach that by saying like, I need to make sure the machine that's accessing my sensitive content is a machine I trust. And if somebody's running things that are like dumping memory and if they're poking around, trying to decrypt things or uncover stuff. But yeah, for the most part, it's up to the application to make sure that that's not in a place where the user can get to it. And I don't know actually the AIP client even uses the file one. I think they use the stream one.
Right. Well, I think it's probably an important distinction to say too, like, it isn't necessarily like the silver bullet, right? We've got to talk about potentially trusted machines or, it sounds like it might be, a server side operation like this, right? Where the web server's doing this work is sort of the trusted place and then showing this to the user. I mean, it's like we always sort of, I don't want to say laugh about DRM, but the whole, like, well, I can always pull my phone out and snap a picture or whatever's on my screen, right? So there's only so much you can do to keep people from getting it. But it would sound like if we're talking about like potentially highly sensitive information, for example, or on machines that potentially I don't control, like a partner or something like that, like that's when we're looking at cool. Like we need to do more server side ops, like a web-based app as opposed to a client app, because we wouldn't want a client app on a malicious machine for a host of other reasons, in addition to the fact that it can be monitored, memory can be dumped, it can look where it's writing to local places, et cetera. Like, ultimately we want this decryption to happen in somewhere and it's a relatively trusted location.
Yeah. There's always trade-offs. I think the important thing is that the encryption itself is secure. Like I need to have the minimum access level to even get the encryption or the decryption key, which would be I have to have the view right. So if I'm granted the view right, after that, we typically say like it's guardrails.
Makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, a trusted machine is going to enforce all the controls. A good application is going to enforce all the controls. But we should understand that like if it's outside of my control, if I have admin rights on a machine, what I can do on that machine to something that I have in memory is pretty endless.
Well, it's about blast radius too, right? Because we're talking about keys that are document specific too, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so it's not like I can just exploit something and all of a sudden I have access to everything. It's
right.
Very like one document at a time.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
So going back to this pattern again, it's just create the engine, create the handler, and then do something on the handler. So remove protection, set label, remove label. And this is where I actually start to either apply label, apply protection, remove label, remove protection, etc. on the file itself, whether it's an actual file on disk or a memory stream or something. All right. Let's talk about auth for a minute, and then we'll dive into the other part of this sample.
Okay.
I think the auth is something that's probably the question we get most frequently is, how does auth work? How do I implement this? And usually my answer is go read the MCell documentation, which isn't great, but it's
getting better.
true.
It's getting better.
So, no, I don't mean the MCell docs are fantastic. I don't mean I mean my answer isn't great.
Okay.
MCell docs are super easy. So the SDK doesn't actually implement any authentication. We rely on the developer to implement an auth delegate. And so we have this iAuth delegate interface somewhere in here, and you have to implement in .NET this acquire token function.
Okay.
We don't care, delete this. I don't care what happens in here. All that I care about at the end is that this returns a valid auth2 token. So however I get that, great.
And to what service? I assume this is to the information protection service, or for what do I need or what audience is that token for?
That's a good question. And this is a common stumbling point when people implement is they'll hard code the audience in here, or they'll hard code like the authority, and you don't have to do any of that. So acquire token takes in 4 parameters today: the identity, so that's going to be the inbound user, the authority, the resource, and claims. My application doesn't ever call this directly. The SDK calls it. So going back to that scenario where I consume a protected file, the SDK extracts that publishing license, goes off to Azure RMS and says, hey, give me a key for this. And RMS says, you don't have a token. Go figure it out. And it returns a challenge that will give me the authority and the resource. So this function can be...
Zoom just a little bit on this code, please?
Yeah. More?
Maybe I can read it. We had a request, so I just want to make sure everyone can read. Everybody can see it. So that looks good.
Cool. So what'll happen at runtime, whether I'm fetching policy, whether I'm decrypting content protected by the rights management service, or whether I'm using our double key encryption, because that's a third resource that we would have, this all gets provided by the SDK. So I don't have to know or do anything with this. All I have to do is make sure that when I'm building my auth request, I'm just taking the authority variable, or I'm looking at the correct resource, or not even the resource. I'm just appending, in my case, I'm told I'm not supposed to do this. I need to change it, but I just append. I didn't learn this till last week, but I just append .default to my resource and then call Azure AD looking for a token. The reason this is really important is because the resource varies. We have the resource for the policy endpoint. We have the resource for the rights management service. And again, we might have the resource for the DKE service if you've configured DKE. The authority can also change. We support sovereign clouds. We support GCC High, 21 ViaNet, and then some of the other clouds that we have out there are all supported here. And if your code is hard coding the authority, you'll have to change it for every cloud that you want to support for your application. And then what was the other thing? Oh, claims. So this will always be empty today. We may have some features in the future, but this is really just future proofing. So you could make your application to actually handle the claims today, and it'll be future proof.
Okay, cool. Okay.
So like you would just add like a with claims, I think here.
With client claims. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Okay. And so all you're looking for is, and so the only thing you need out of here is an application, or is an access token. Now, does that need? I guess my curiosity is around the sort of the context. Is this a user? Is it a user context? Is it an app context? Is there a pro or con, or what's is it users or apps that we're looking at here? Getting tokens for, I mean.
So in this case, we're using a confidential client, and we're not doing any sort of on behalf of for this application. So what happens is we have a client secret. and then we're just requesting a token on behalf of the service principal. We could do some. I have another sample out there that I think does the on behalf of flow.
Okay.
And then we just.
And so that would mean that operations that are happening against the services, be it getting the list of policies or protecting a file, etc., those are going to happen under either the user's context or the app's context. And is there a pattern, or like in terms of configuration or anything that you see more frequently, or are there things that we should look out for with one route or the other?
Yeah, it depends really on the application. Let's look at. So typically speaking, if it's a client application, obviously it's a public client, so that's going to happen with delegated permissions, all in the scope of the user. If it's a service-based application like SharePoint Online, Power BI, they have really two options. One is operate in the service context and then use some of our delegated functionality, which we'll talk about in a minute, to do operations on behalf of the user, or I shouldn't say on behalf of the user, it's mixing up terminology, to actually do an operation as the user from our services perspective. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The other option is to do like an OBO flow where I take the user token, take my service token, and then get a token for the user to something on the back end. And that's another option as well. And that, as far as our service is concerned, looks like a delegated flow. So I'm just operating in the context of the user.
Okay.
So maybe this will make more sense. Let's look at the application registration, and we'll look at the permissions, and we can walk through each of these, and then we'll jump back to the app and I'll show how they're implemented.
Could you zoom this in a couple taps?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So under API permissions, you can see we've got all application permissions except this graph one, which I don't think I'm actually using. And these are really the four that we support for the rights management service, which is content.delegated reader, delegated writer, super user, and writer. These two allow me to both read and write content on behalf of a user. So I don't need the user's token.
Right.
My application can just say, hey, I'm Bob at Contoso. And the rights management service says, hey, Bob, and does the operation on behalf of Bob. So this is a somewhat privileged operation. You want to make sure it's a trusted application to give out, especially delegated reader. Writer, not a big deal. Delegated reader will allow me to impersonate anybody in the tenant to read content on their behalf.
Okay.
But it also allows me to do things like perform that access check. So going back to that upload that I showed you, we would create that delegated engine, we call it, and we would say, hey, I'm Bob. Do I have access to do this thing? And the first thing it's going to do is say, does Bob have access to this content at all? And if not, I get an exception. And then the next step is, all right, do the access check. Does Bob have the export, owner, whatever? And then we can put some business logic around that in our application. So that's the common use case for delegated reader.
Okay.
Delegated writer, same thing, opposite direction. I'm just going to apply protection to a file. Super user is the big one. So super user is not an admin in the sense that it doesn't let me change anything in the service. It's literally just a more privileged user. And this user has access to decrypt anything in my tenant, period. Like files, emails, whatever, for any user. So this is going to be used in scenarios where I'm not going to do this delegated thing. I don't have a user identity to pass in, but my service needs to decrypt this content. So going back to your DLP scenarios, DLP is not operating in terms of a user, so it needs super user to decrypt any content to do an inspection. E-discovery use cases are also very common for super user. Anywhere that I need to make sure that some service or individual can decrypt anything in the tenant for insert job function here, we would give them super user.
Okay. So the delegated reader writer, I have a quick question on those.
Sure.
Do the operations that are done, do they show as being done by the user? Do they show that they were done by the app on behalf of the user? Like if I'm looking through audit logs and we use the delegated reader permission to open the Excel sheet, for example, how does that look? Does that show the application was involved at all, or is it just the user?
The service protection logs would show the user did it and would probably show the service principal ID. I'd have to take a look. They would certainly show the app ID in the log.
Okay, I think that's probably most critical is making sure that that say a rogue app or malicious application or something that was granted permission that was transferred users or something that I'd be able to see like, hey, actually he didn't really open this. It was this, this malicious app or, whatever, or something that was acting on behalf of the user. But if it shows up with the app ID, I think that's probably sufficient.
Yeah. So in this one, actually, I think I'd have to go to the other view, to the actual audit portal and do an export where I should see the client ID.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. No, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So then the last one here is content.writer. That just allows, so going back to the scenario you mentioned where I said, oh, the application actually created this file, that Excel sheet that I didn't have full control over. This lets the service principal just write a file. So the service principal itself becomes the owner of that content. So there's no delegated anything here. It's just my MVC Razor sample owns the file now. The upside here is that it can decrypt anything that it owns. So if I upload it, if I download from that service and I re-upload it, it can just decrypt it because it's the owner. It doesn't need this super user write or anything special to do the decryption. Then the last role we need for this application, we'll skip the graph one because it's not necessary, is this unified policy tenant read. I'll actually show where that's at really quick before we get into it. So rights management, super easy to find. It's on the front page. I can click here, go to either delegated or application permissions and add the rights that I need. And this is our delegated scope. If I want to find the sync service, it's not listed. So I actually have to search for Microsoft information. And this is all in our documentation. Search for Microsoft Information Protection Sync Service. And then here I'll see either my delegated or app permission. We only have one of each. So the delegated permission here allows me with a user credential to download the user policy. And the application permission will allow me to either delegate as a user, pick a specific user and download their policy, or download the entire tenant policy. So I would see every label that's published in the tenant.
Sorry, Tom. I think I'm back now. For whatever reason, my internet seems to have dropped out. So I'm back now. This is why you shouldn't get your internet from a cellular tower.
I recommend fiber. So I was just going over content writer really quick. We talked about this allows the service principal to write that information. So
okay, cool.
Going back to the example earlier where that Excel sheet was actually owned by the service, this is what happened. It performed that operation as itself rather than using one of these delegated permissions.
Okay.
And then the last one here is just this unified policy tenant read, where this application has rights to read policy as any user in the tenant or read the policy for the whole organization.
Okay.
So I'd list all labels. So that said, going back, if we want to look at the, so we've made it through auth, right? Like my app starts, it gets a token. I try to do something. SDK passes things in here and I end up just doing some MCell stuff and getting a token back. You can make this do whatever you want. If it's a public client app, obviously you'd want to have some interface so that the user can log in. This also works with our on-prem product. So you can use this same auth delegate to connect to ADRMS via ADFS. So we use ADFS when connecting to the on-prem services. And the same generic acquire token will work there.
Neat. Okay, cool.
So looking back, so I mentioned the delegated permissions that we have, the delegated read write. So what I can do actually to instantiate an engine that's for one of those delegated operations is I've built this method that's a part of this service called get delegated engine. Super easy. I create it the exact same way that I showed before. There's this file engine settings. I specify the cloud. I don't always have to do that if I'm providing an email address that's part of commercial cloud. And then I just specify the delegated user email address.
Got it. Okay. And the email address is interesting. So I'm thinking I come to your webpage, I sign in as me, that user ID, we're going to get it from, we're going to get it from claims. We're going to get it somewhere. Is it just email, or can we take an object ID or a UPN? Like how much flexibility do we have on what those look like?
UPN and anything that's in my proxy addresses in my user object.
Okay.
Our service works off of email addresses because we don't have a way across tenant or across organizations to, like, if I send you an external email that's encrypted, my organization doesn't know anything about your user object ID. So there's not a great way for us to go back and map that back to the original recipient. So we use email addresses here. So you could, UPN, one of my email addresses, has to be a verified domain. If I don't own the domain, it won't work.
Good call out. That's good to know. Okay. All right.
So this is really it. So that delegated permission for both, this is a pretty generic engine creation. Doesn't matter if it's read or write. I'm just saying, hey, give me a delegated engine for whatever user I pass in here. And now if we look back at some of these other calls, it doesn't really matter anymore when I'm doing like apply label for, apply MIP label, for example. I've stored this engine. I've created a cache. So I added this delegated engine. And this method doesn't know that I'm doing any sort of delegation. It doesn't care. I'm just saying this engine is delegated, apply a label to this file, and everything happens internally.
Yeah, that's awesome.
The read and write operation.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I love the separation. It does make it very easy to use in a variety of scenarios. We spend a lot of time on this show talking about trusted subsystems versus passing user permissions and things like that through. And I think in the delegated sense, when we're looking at, when we've got one of these delegated engines, all those operations are happening as that user. So presumably at that point, the application it doesn't care if you do or don't have permissions to it, in the sense that, like, you either have it or have them, or you don't in the delegated case. And if you do, then the operations will succeed because we can make these checks. In the case where you're operating as the principal, as the app itself, then it would be up to you as the user or as the developer to make those checks, to make sure to do those checks, right? To say, does user ABC have export rights to this document, because you're talking to the service as the application, not as the user, right?
Right. Yeah. So like in this case, maybe I'm building an online, I don't know, printing service. I would want to say here, like handler dot protection. Nothing's working today. Handler. Yeah, access check, and I would just say write dot print. Not that.
Right.
And so I'd wrap this in some if statement, say, all right, does the user have the print right? Great, print it for him. And that's my job as the developer, using that privilege role, because really that delegated read is a privileged role. So admins should ask questions when an app developer says, hey, I want to grant admin consent for this. You should ask some questions. Same with super user.
And I think that's really the key, or maybe the core I'm trying to get to, is like, in the normal way that folks, or not normal, but in the way that you and the rest of the sort of API architects, the way that you designed and the types of use cases you considered, I think an admin knowing why somebody's coming to them saying, hey, I need this admin consent done, is really, really important, because of course, we all know the fun in and out of admin consent and asking for it. And so is any of that documented anywhere today? Like, and I don't mean to put you on the spot if it's not, but is there any sort of explanation of what if I'm a dev and I need to get this, what should I send to my admins to say, hey, this is why I need this, and this is my justification? Do we have anything that they can use today for that?
So all of our docs are at aka.ms/MIP-SDK docs. And under here, you'll see concepts, API permissions. So this will describe really what what you can do and where these rights might be used by different applications. So, I mean, we don't really get into like maybe security concerns, but I think that if folks had feedback on like what would be helpful to include here to talk their admins into giving them rights they need to get their app shipped, we could expand this.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think this could be good enough for a host of folks. I mean, I hate to say it, but I do feel like there's probably a level of the kind of customer who's got devs who are integrating with MIP directly. Likely has a heavy MIP use case, like something that they're using MIP for heavily, and so I feel like those security discussions would likely have be a part of it. But of course, there's nothing wrong with arming folks with more information rather than less. So okay, cool, thank you. Yeah, so that's awesome. I mean, I think it's it seems extremely straightforward, right? I mean, there's the admin of the service, but if I'm building something to either interrogate the files that my employees are building or that they're storing in our services or whatever, or if I want to start protecting files from my own apps, it seems like it really is quite straightforward in how we're able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that there's we have some good samples out there. The samples are at, again, aka.ms/MIP-SDK samples. And then there's this one that I'm working on that I'm hoping to, some feedback we've had is that, and maybe some people watching are kind of getting this, there's a little bit of overhead to setting this up. This whole initialization step here is sometimes a lot for people to wrap their head around at the beginning. And even as I was working on this app yesterday, finding like integrating with Azure Blob Storage was copy and paste a few things and it was working and it was really simple. And I'm not sure we're there yet on some of this. So we do have some work to do. I'm hoping that this application, as I get this kind of wrapped up and polished, will help people to at least take this sort of service class as like a good example of how to make this a little bit easier. And then yeah, totally like integrate this into line of business apps and protect more stuff as close to the data as you can, rather than relying on DLP and downstream systems to protect it for you.
Yeah, I think it looks great. Like if I feel like I could go build something with MIP like this afternoon, compared to where I was when we first started talking this morning, I feel way more comfortable feeling like this is pretty accessible. Like it's a fairly accessible way for us to start protecting our data. And you mentioned, so this is obviously the .NET SDK, but you mentioned there's C++ and what other stacks do you have SDKs for today?
Right now we support C++ across Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. We support we support .NET on Windows and Ubuntu 2004 and 2204, I think. And then we have a Java preview, which is supported on Windows and Ubuntu. I'm hoping that sometime this year we can GA that and support it on all of the platforms that we have support for C++. An important thing is that our SDK is both .NET and Java are wrappers, so they have a native dependencies. So unfortunately we're not like a pure Java implementation today or a pure .NET implementation today.
Good to know. So for someone like, I hate to be that guy, someone like me who uses Macs, my options today is C++. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I will anxiously await. I will throw my 2 cents into this to say I'd love to see a .NET Mac implementation, but I understand that's that's a lot to ask too. So.
Yeah, I think it's a question of just I'm going to say just and oversimplify, and somebody in engineering is going to yell at me later. But just getting those builds out there for these, like this application that you're looking at would run. No reason you couldn't run this in Ubuntu today using our Ubuntu package. So I think there's value in us getting all of these supported across .NET 6 and 7, so that we just have that cross-platform support.
Well, I love it. Hey, it's great, especially for a service that has so much sort of like it feels like there's so much potential for things that you could do, and especially as we see more and more customers get really tapped into like lots of different clouds and lots of different services, and everybody's got partners and vendors and 4 billion other people that they have to work with on a daily basis. I don't want to say the thing that everybody says because it makes my heart hurt. But when everybody says we need to do more with less, I absolutely hate that saying. I don't think you should ever apply that to people. Unless you're like a weight loss motivational speaker or something, like that's the only time do more with less should ever apply to human beings. But I think this is pretty relevant. Like there's a lot of, we're seeing so much sort of like the cross cloud of I've got stuff in Azure and I got stuff in AWS and in GCP and in Office and I've got data here and there and everywhere. And managing that and being able to sort of handle that is really, it's quite a task. And we see, I'm thinking about like we've got customers who build their own portals for managing things like privilege escalation and things like that. And so you think we aren't that far away from managing files that we need to share with other folks. I mean, I'm sure we've all had to use something that when we've worked with somebody else, we've always had to use one of those like online decryption services. And, I'm just not, I'd much rather it be native. So one quick question in Office, I'm assuming the Office for every platform that Office runs on that's supported, that's all this is baked into Office. So that's not a function of SDK availability, right? Okay, cool.
Yeah. We support anywhere Office is supported today. This is supported.
So is there anybody you want to shout out, anything coming up that we should be looking for on the MIP front or on the Purview front? Is there anything like exciting that's happening? I mean, I get that it's like compliance and security, so we have to dig deep, but we do that in identity every day. So
yeah. I think right now the only top of mind things for me are we're going to ship MIP SDK 1.13 in the next hopefully week or two. And that's got an update for some changes we made around CBC mode encryption for Office files. So that'll be an important update for partners and line of business apps to take later this year. And then hoping in the second half of this year, we'll GA our Graph API. So the Graph API offers a subset of functionality around just our policy interfaces. And so we'll ship that later this year.
Very cool. You'll have to come back for that one.
Yeah. Once we get that out, I will happily return. And then I think the last thing is, keep feedback coming around. You need Python or something else that we don't offer today. Like we'd love to hear about it. If a pure Java implementation is required for you to get started on this, we'd love to hear about it. I can't promise anything, but that feedback's always super helpful for us to get things prioritized.
Best way to get feedback to you and your team, is there you got a forum or a GitHub issues, or how would you prefer folks get in touch with you if they've got those kinds of needs and feedback?
Yeah, we if you go to I can follow up with these links, but it's aka.ms/ask IP team. We'll take you to our Yammer. But it's gated. You have to get approved, but it's public. We approve everybody. So that's one way. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. My Twitter handle in here, but it's Miltor, MILT0R.
Nice. I love that. Okay. And it was aka.ms/ask IP team?
Yes.
Or AIP team. Okay. Ask the IP team.
Yep.
Okay. I don't want somebody to go there and then end up talking to a bunch of lawyers. That's all. So it's identity protection. So go there. If you're already connected into the advisors groups and some of the other Yammer groups, this should be a relatively straightforward operation to get there. If you're not, feel free to reach out. And of course, we have our own Discord that everyone is welcome to come and join. We'll make sure to get that link out here into the chat so you can go join our Discord. Big collection of people that like to talk about identity. So,
Discord also, so you can ping me there.
Awesome. So you're on Discord, we're on Discord, everybody's on Discord. So that's the place to go if you need some help, or if you got feedback and you just want to let it all out, come and visit us in Discord. So for now, Tom, thank you so much. This has been great. I've learned a ton. I'm super pumped about taking a look and digging into this a whole lot more, because I think that, like you said, there's so many new use cases that customers are going into. So thanks for taking a big chunk of your day going and spending it with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. And like I said, reach out and we'll take feedback, help out where we can, and love to hear about any integrations that people are building.
Cool. All right, friends, we got to raid somebody. Let's go to I guess we'll go to Mr. Linksdorf. I'm sure he's doing some JavaScript today. JavaScript AIP client, obviously that'll be the next ask, clearly. So we'll go over there today, I suppose, for our raid. We'll be back on Thursday, I believe. Our friends from, I need to go back and check, but I'm fairly certain that we are having another EPM deep dive from our friends in Latin America. So this will be in Spanish. Or maybe this one's in Portuguese. I'm not sure. But this Thursday, just a couple days from now, we have. This Thursday we're announcing the winners of the hackathon. So if you remember or you participated in the EPM hackathon last month, we are announcing those winners this Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. So let's go raid Mr. Linksdorf. We will be back on Tuesday. I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your week. And until we meet again. Tom, stay safe and stay protecting your data, I suppose. And
I'll try.
We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Bye, everybody.